it's easy to want the benefits of something. At the end of the
Yeah.
day, we all want the same benefits. We all want to be rich. We all want to be popular. We all want to be liked and loved by everybody. Like there's not really much that's interesting or unique about that. What is interesting and unique is what sacrifices each of us is willing to make to get those things.
Robert, you're six-time best-selling author with a strong following both within business and the musical world. But do you mind just giving people a brief intro of who Robert Greene really is?
Well, I don't even really know who Robert Greene really is, but I'll try to do my best. Basically, I've been trying to write my whole life. I'm 60 years old. Tomorrow I turn 61 is my birthday. And so, early on in my life, I worked as a journalist in New York, and that didn't quite mesh with my tastes. Then I tried wandering around Europe and writing novels, and that didn't really work out. I was starving. And then I came to Hollywood. I'm from Los Angeles, and I tried to work in the film business. And I hated the film business, but I knew I wanted to be a writer. I just couldn't figure out what it was. And then I had the good luck to meet a man in 1995 who was a book packager, a book producer. He asked me if I had any ideas for books. And at that point, I kind of improvised what turned into the 48 Laws of Power because I had had so many different jobs and I had seen so many different manipulative games being played, particularly in Hollywood, that this book just kind of, I just almost like vomited it out of me. I was very inspired. He loved it. He paid me to write the first half of the book, and the rest is history. Since then, I've been writing 5, 6 other books. I've been extremely lucky. And, for the past 23 years, all I do is write books, research, and do my consulting work. It's a pretty great life, I have to say.
Amazing, amazing. And Mark, you're also a best-selling author and at the same time an expert on throwing F-bombs around. Would you mind giving a short introduction of yourself?
Sure. My name is Mark Manson, and I kind of also stumbled into my career unintentionally, and I started writing online in 2007. At first, I just blogged because it was a fun thing to do. I never considered it. I never knew where it was going or what was going to happen, and things started to slowly snowball. And by about 2011, I realized, my God, I could actually make a career out of this. Like this thing that's kind of been a side hobby could actually be
Yeah.
my career. And so from there, I focused 100% of my time on writing online and publishing online. Grew my website to millions of monthly readers. Had large amounts of success on social media. Published my first book in 2016. So, I conveniently have them here to pimp them out. The Solar Not Giving an F, and became a mega bestseller. And then last year, my follow-up, which is called Everything is Effed, a book about hope, came out and has done very well as well. So it's great to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely, amazing, amazing, and thank you guys again both so much for joining. Robert, you're a world-leading expert on human psychology, understanding people and their emotions. You briefly touched on it, but for those who don't know, how did you get into this area of expertise, and why is it so fascinating to you?
Well, I think when I was very young, I remember I was struck by looking at my parents that I had this idea that people are always kind of playing a role, like they're actors in a play, that they have to be the role of the husband or the wife or whatever. I was struck by that when I was about 8 years old. And when you think that people are actually performing, that they're acting a role, you ask yourself, what is it that's behind their mask? What is it that's really going on behind? What are their real thoughts that they're not telling you? What are their secrets? And I was obsessed with that from a very, very early age. There's a writer who writes about that a lot, who I connect to very well. His name is Irving Kaufman, and he analyzes the performance aspect of human interactions. And so, if you've been observing people for over 50 years, like I have since I was a child, analyzing them, taking apart, trying to figure out what their real thoughts are, what's going on behind all their smiles, etc., you develop a certain kind of skill in being able to read people. So it's merely a function of practicing this for many, many years, which is basically the elemental skill of any writer, is having a deep, deep interest in people and what motivates them. And then you add on to that the fact that I've read hundreds and hundreds of books on psychology. And I guess that, I don't know if that makes me an expert, but that makes me someone who has a very unique perspective on human psychology.
Certainly, certainly, certainly. I also want to ask you, Mark, you've also spent a great deal of time studying human behavior and have emphasized in, as you mentioned, your New York Times bestseller, The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F, that human beings are flawed, they're limited, and not everyone can be special. Where does this mindset come from, and how did this inspire your book?
Well, it's funny because I definitely relate to Robert's answer. I grew up in a very conservative part of Texas, and a very religious area of Texas, and I never felt like I really fit in. My values and beliefs didn't really match the environment that I was growing up in, and I also noticed a major discrepancy between what, say, my parents and teachers and other authority figures said, and then the actual behaviors that they did. You know, I would see them preach compassion and understanding and loving your neighbor as yourself and all these things, and they would smile and say the right things on Sunday. But then I would watch their behavior and they would behave completely differently. And so around my early teenage years, I just became very confused and I guess a little bit obsessive. Like, why do people behaving this way? Like, why even go through the whole rigmarole of saying you believe in this thing if you're not going to follow it? And so it actually started more with philosophy, but psychology, human behavior, uh, understanding the history of culture and why certain traditions exist. It became a hobby of mine from a very young age. I joke on, I think in one of my books, I say, like while other kids were listening to Backstreet Boys, I was reading Nietzsche, and
Yeah.
it was interesting and fun for me, and it continued into my 20s. And when I started writing online, it just felt like a natural thing to write about because it was something that I had always been interested in from the beginning.
Yeah. Interesting. So yeah, among many things, you guys are both, at least in my eyes, experts on understanding people's emotions and how one should detach from one's emotions in order to make better decisions as well. Right now, I think most people will agree that the entire world is in a complex and very difficult situation currently. I'm therefore very curious to hear how you would each advise people on how they should right now detach themselves from their emotions in order to make better decisions and master self-control, even on how to maybe reset the mind when facing obstacles like the coronavirus right now.
You want me to go first?
Yeah,
Sure.
please do, Robert. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's something I write about a lot in my last book, The Laws of Human Nature.
Yeah.
The first thing you have to understand, you have to admit to yourself that you are a stranger to yourself, that you really don't know who you are, that you are subject to all kinds of emotions and feelings and sensations that are basically unconscious, and that you don't really know why you are angry, you don't really know why you're depressed, you don't really know why you're excited by this person or that thing, that there are all kinds of unconscious things happening inside of you, things that you can't really control. And so in this time period where we're all quarantined, This is a major, major opportunity for you to actually look at yourself and observe yourself with a degree of detachment. And the idea is simply that you don't give into your emotions. You don't simply say, oh, I'm angry, therefore I need to react, that your emotions are justified. Instead, you need to develop the habit, and it's basically a habit that's very easy to develop and will do wonders for you throughout life. It's perhaps one of the most important life skills you can develop. You develop the habit of taking a step back. And in that moment where you're feeling fear for your career or you're feeling angry at this person, you take a step back just for a moment and you ask yourself, why am I angry? What is the source of my fear? Is it really from this thing that's facing me right now, or does it have another source? And you go and you analyze a bit the emotion, and you perhaps figure out that maybe it stemmed from a mood that I had yesterday, or somebody said something and I'm carrying it over, or maybe it's something I read about, or maybe it's something that comes from my childhood, whatever. So you develop the habit of slowly detaching yourself from your own emotions and developing the ability to analyze them and to see that there might be other sources of them than you consciously think about. And slowly, 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 you develop the ability to step back and not react. And I tell you, you can start tomorrow. It's like exercise. It's like tomorrow you want to lose weight and you want to get in shape. Well, you start slowly. You don't run 10 miles, you run like around the block once. Well, here you want to start slowly. So you take one in the course of today, you suddenly catch yourself feeling a particular emotion. You're depressed or you're bored, and you step back and you think about it. You analyze it. Perhaps you write it down and try and figure out what is it that is actually making me bored, depressed, or fearful. And that is the most important critical skill that you can develop right now is this sense of detachment. And it'll carry over in your life. And you'll notice if you develop this, it's actually an incredibly beautiful thing. You'll notice that when somebody sends you an email that gets you irritated or they don't respond to you, instead of reacting and writing an email back at them that's going to get you in all sorts of trouble, you find yourself telling yourself, no, wait. You get patient and you say, maybe I shouldn't react. Maybe there's something else going on. And you develop a kind of calmness in life. So you really, really, I can't emphasize how much you need to work on this in this particular time in the quarantine when you have the time and the space to actually develop this skill.
I agree totally, and I think I would add to that. I think it's one thing that I see people confuse a lot is the difference between detachment from emotion and suppression of emotion. I think
Yeah.
a lot of people come to me and they say, "I'm very angry. How do I stop being angry?" Or I'm so sad about this thing that happened. I don't want to be sad anymore. Uh, it's not about getting rid of the negative emotion. It's about, as Robert was explaining, it's about recognizing the emotion and channeling it in a more effective way, and understanding that emotion is not destiny. It's a good analogy that I use sometimes is it's like sailing. It's you
Yeah.
if you're sailing, you don't control the wind, which way the wind blows. You have to adjust the sail to leverage the wind to take you where you want to go. And you are always, while you don't control the wind, you are always in control of your sail. And it's like he said, it's a skill that you have to develop, that you have to practice and hone over a lifetime. I don't know if we ever get really, really good at it, but you certainly get better at it as time goes on.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add something that Mark said because that's actually very true, and he's exactly right. I'm not talking about learning to repress your emotions. I love your metaphor of the sailing. The other metaphor I like to use is of a horse, a rider on a horse. And the horse represents your emotions, it represents your animal self. And you are the rider on top of it. That is your executive, your rational functions. And that horse contains a lot of power, a lot of energy. Your emotions contain a lot of energy. It what makes you inspired. It makes you want to get up in the day. It makes you want to write a book. So a good rider of a horse doesn't hold the reins really tightly and try and control the horse too much, which is what Mark talks about in trying to repress your emotions. But if you completely
Yeah.
let go of the reins and you let the horse go wherever it wants, which is letting your emotions take you on. You have no control, and you can't get the horse to do what you want. But if you've ever ridden a horse, you know how to hold it a certain way, not too tight, not too loose. The horse begins to respond, and then you have the power to control it wherever you want, and you end up using that tremendous energy of the horse for very practical, productive purposes. So it's not about getting rid of your anger. Anger is actually a very productive emotion. I would not have written the 48 Laws of Power, which was my biggest seller, without a lot of anger. I learned how to channel that anger, but make it productive and make it rational by analyzing what it is that actually makes me angry. So I completely agree with what Mark said about that.
It makes a ton of sense, and especially both the sailing and the horse. I think from there, I would definitely. I think one of the biggest obstacles, and also the first step of the way, would be, well, I can see the logic in all of this, but it's absolutely easier said than done. So where would I start, Robert? You mentioned it a little bit. Maybe, write down these emotions during the day and then reflect on them at night, or what would sort of your first step for people, your first advice be in order to detach one from the emotions that one person has?
Well, you're right. It's not simple, but you have to be able to learn how to observe yourself, have a degree of
Yeah,
self-awareness. And so, it's easier to start with very major emotions. Now, I make the point in my books that no emotions are pure. You never feel pure love. Your love is actually mixed with a bit of hatred or a bit of ambivalence. But if you can look at a powerful, relatively pure emotion like fear, which is something that a lot of people are afraid of, right? Are dealing with right now. You're afraid
yeah,
about your career. Let's say you're at home right now and you're really worried about whether you'll have a job in 5 or 6 months. Okay, that's a very reasonable and rational fear. I want you, instead of getting all wound up and panicking and having that continual loop of that voice in your head going, what am I going to do? What's happening? Kind of not being very logical and in control. I want you to ask
yeah,
yourself, all right, what is it that I'm actually afraid of? What is the course? What is actually happening in my field, in my career? Is this something that will have a future in 6 months? And then analyzing
yeah,
what it is you're actually afraid of instead of what you're reading about. And then maybe with a degree of calmness and detachment, you can say, well, maybe I don't like my career. Maybe I never was happy before the coronavirus. Maybe what I'm really actually dealing with is not fear, but actually kind of frustration and disappointment. I don't like where my life was going, and now I have to confront it. But you're confusing it with fear if you step back and analyze it. And then maybe you need to
yeah,
tell yourself, well, perhaps I need to take a different direction in my career. Maybe I need to think of something else. Maybe in a year or two, I want to take a slightly different path. And if you come to that realization, then you can start saying, all right, well, now in this period where I'm alone in my apartment, I can start maybe
yeah,
planning for that. I can maybe start reading, developing some new skills, reading some books, taking some online courses. And as you have a longer term vision and you think of 2 years down the line, you start calming yourself down. That fear now goes into something else. So, take fear as a very good emotion to begin with. Or I like taking
yeah,
anger because that's one where we usually um, project it onto someone else. We pretend that we're
yeah,
angry at our spouse or our children, but in fact, we're actually disappointed in ourselves or angry with our parents or angry with something somebody said yesterday. So if you feel anger, yes, take a journal out and start thinking about it and start saying, when did the anger start? Did it start right now or did it actually start this morning? Was I feeling
yeah,
frustration? Was it boiling up in me the day before? This is a very practical step you can take and you can start analyzing it. But these baby steps that you begin to take, where you start looking at yourself as if you're a stranger, will slowly
yeah,
become into a habit.
Yeah, generally speaking, I think the process to build the skill or to practice the skill is anything that is going to remove you from your subjective experience and make it appear as kind of an outside objective thing that you can look at as, so
yeah,
when we're sitting alone by ourselves being angry, it's impossible for us to really look at that anger as if we're like an impartial observer. But anything that helps you develop, that kind of separates your awareness from that emotion, and lets you poke at it and look at it and ask questions like Robert was talking about, is going to help you do that. So journaling does that. Therapy does that. Having somebody specifically ask you, what is it about your anger that, or what is it about the situation that is actually making you angry? What are you afraid of? These things force you to remove the anger from your present experience and put it in front of you and look at it as if it's like an object that you're analyzing. A good course or a good teacher can do it. Meditation can do it. So there are a lot of different practices that can get at the same thing, but ultimately it's the same principle at work, which is simply looking at your own conscious experience as if it's outside of you, if that makes sense.
Somebody mentioned here, and Mark just mentioned about meditation, and that's something I've been doing now for about 10 years. And that has really, really helped me in this process, because when you meditate, you're alone. You're having kind of sensory deprivation. You're not hearing anything or listening to anything. You're kind of alone with your thoughts. And in those moments, you can observe yourself. You can see all kinds of thoughts bubbling up to the surface that you can't really control, that a lot of them have a lot of deep emotions in them. And you can really, really, really begin to observe yourself in these moments and see, see the patterns in your thinking, why you're obsessed about this. And I developed the ability in meditation to begin to see myself as a kind of, that these emotions are almost like a stranger within me. They're not really me. As Mark said, emotions is not your destiny. It's not really who you are. You are somebody else. You can develop this kind of meta consciousness where you're looking at yourself from the outside. And I've noticed since I've meditated, I don't react as much to things around me. I'm able to take a step back. It's almost like a habit. You develop your mind, a kind of inner calmness where you don't react to what people are saying. So it's one of the greatest tools in what we're talking about in developing this.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly. You also briefly mentioned there, Robert, when you sit and reflect and you might, think of, well, am I stuck in a job that I'm not really excited about, or, just in general, collecting your thoughts and, reflecting on these. One of the most insightful things that I have ever learned from you is the difference between a lifetime and dead time. I think a lot of people should know about this concept, and especially during this time. Do you mind just sharing a brief insight on what you mean by dead time and what you mean by a lifetime?
I'll try to be brief, but it's a little difficult. Basically, you don't really own anything. I want you to make this awareness. You don't own anything. The possessions that you have, the people around you, they will disappear. Life is fleeting. They will die. You can't, as they say, you can't take it with you. You don't even own your house or your car in the end. The only thing that you own, the only thing that is yours is time. The time that you're born, the time that you live. You can even look at it as a product, like you have 70 or 80 or 90 years to live. That is the only thing that is truly yours and you possess. And that product that is yours, that thing that you own, you can either make it your own, you can either have it and possess it and control it, or you can give it up to other people. You can let them control your time. And so dead time is when you let other people, when you work for other people and they control when you show up at work, when you go home, what your thoughts, you come home and you can't think about yourself, you're thinking about your boss, about all these other dramas that are going on in your life. They've possessed you. And that time that is so precious, that is the only thing that you own, is suddenly given away. And you're not doing anything, and you don't own it, and you're not making anything happen with it. And so a lifetime is when you take the time that you have and you make it your own. You create something with it. You create your own business, or you come home and you do your own work, or whatever it is, your own thoughts. You're not controlled by other people. They're not controlling your time. And so In this period of the coronavirus, when you're quarantined, dead time would be watching a lot of news, just being glued to Fox or
Yeah.
CNN or NBC or social media, where your thoughts are inhabited by other people and they own that precious, precious time that you now have. Or you're constantly listening to other people and you're doing what they tell you to do.
Yeah.
And a lifetime would be reading books. When you read a book, you are by yourself, you're interacting with some other great writer, hopefully a great writer, and you're having a conversation with them with your own thoughts. That's a lifetime your brain is developing. When you're learning a skill, when you're playing the piano, when you're playing chess, that's a lifetime. So that's basically, as quickly as I can, the difference between the two.
Yeah. Mark, is it something that you relate to as well? Dead time versus a lifetime. You might not use those exact words, but is it? Do you see it in the same way?
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
you know, for me, it's one thing I talk about a lot is just the concept of like you are always choosing. You know, it's
Yeah.
there's, whether you realize it or not, you are always making a choice in your experience. And so if you are choosing to give up your experience, if you are choosing to simply do what the people around you demand of you or expect of you,
Yeah.
and you don't like that, at the core of it, that is still a choice that you've made, even if you don't realize it. And ultimately, the only way to kind of take that a lifetime back is through recognizing that choice of like that in every moment you are able to decide, what am I doing with this moment?
Yeah. Certainly.
Um,
I know that
I just
I know. Yeah. Go
I'm
ahead,
sorry.
Robert.
I
Go
just have
ahead.
one other
Yeah.
thing to say. I read a book recently for research for my next book. It's called The
Hmm.
Sun Does Shine. It's written by a man who was wrongly convicted of murder in, I believe, Alabama in the 80s. He spent 30 years on death row and he was innocent. And he wrote this amazing book.
Wow.
And he shows in prison where you have absolutely no control, where everybody controls your routines, what you eat, what you wear. He developed a lifetime in that period by reading and thinking for himself. And he describes in a brilliant manner the process that he
Yeah.
developed it. So if somebody in prison, for God's sake, can create
Yeah.
a lifetime, that means that any of us can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly. Certainly, I know that we have a bunch of leaders sitting out there listening, and decision makers, also hopeful and aspiring leaders. I'm curious to what you guys' advice would be to them in terms of how to deeply understand the primitive forces that are driving and motivating colleagues and employees, and how to better understand the intrinsic motivation during these times. What would a great advice from you guys be to leaders in terms of motivating their employees during a crisis like this one?
Well, I'll let Mark go first here.
um, yeah, you give me the hard one.
Yeah.
It's 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 hard to say, because I mean, I think one thing that is, I mean, every crisis is unique, but one thing that's difficult about this time is that everybody's experience is so different. You know, some
Yeah.
businesses are just completely collapsing. Some businesses are
Mm.
booming. Some people
Yeah.
are, you know, still going along. Some people, it's more their personal lives are disrupted, or they're working from home. You know, what I've
Yeah.
noticed in general, I'll just kind of speak generally to what I've noticed, both with
Yeah.
myself, my own team, and then, you know, people I talk to, friends with businesses and things like that. Um, there's a general emotional volatility that's going on right now,
Mm.
and it's, at least what I'm trying to do with my own employees and my own friends is simply understand what each person is going through. Because what I've noticed is that people are handling this period in different ways. Some people are getting very angry. Some people are getting
Yeah.
very fearful. Some people are getting very sad and mopey and can't get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
And so I just try to meet them where they are and just understand, I've been trying to make it a point to check in with my employees, kind of say like, hey, is everything going all right? How are you feeling? Is your sleep schedule good? How's your family? Things like that, because everybody's responding a little bit differently, and so they need uh and I don't see it so much as my job to like, get your ass back to work. It's more my job to just simply understand where they are in their own emotional process, and let them know that I hear them, and I understand, and I want to work with them to make sure, like, to get them back on track and make sure that they're feeling okay. And I think that's ultimately, I've been very fortunate in that my business is doing fine. But like, I've got friends and family with businesses that are in a really tough spot right now, and I think what seems to be working best in those places is be honest, tell your employees the situation, tell them like, hey, we might not be around in 3 months. But also be respectful and empathetic, and do the right thing by them. Take care of them if you can take care of them, and if you can't, be honest about that. I think really what we owe each other in a time like this is above all mutual respect and transparency. And I think if you can do that, then it that's what matters above everything else.
Yeah, great answer. And transparency, like I hear you say. Yeah, what's your take, Robert?
Well, I don't really have much more to add. I think Mark pretty much hit all the points.
Yeah,
in my last book, I talk about authority and what makes a great leader, and it's kind of a timeless quality. And I used in that particular chapter Queen Elizabeth I of England as the example. So it's a kind of a skill as a leader that transcends time. It transcends whether you're in a crisis or not. But in a crisis, what happens is, so in engineering, if they wanted to see whether a bridge is weak or whether a building is weak, they put it through a stress test. They simulate it. And what stress does is it reveals the hidden cracks, the weaknesses. And so when we're dealing with a crisis like we all are, we're seeing the cracks and the flaws in our leaders. You're also seeing it in your employees, etc. So as a leader, you want to take this moment to look at yourself and see what are your own weaknesses and what are your own flaws that are coming up. Are you getting supremely irrational? Are you pretending to panic, etc.? And as far as the timeless qualities of leaders that transcend the moment, empathy is probably the most important one. You're dealing with a team of people, each one with a different history, coming from a different cultural background. We're all now dealing with people who come from all parts of the world, men and women, etc. And you need to have developed the skill of getting into their world, listening to them, and trying to feel like what they might be going through right now. Because it's actually kind of difficult if you're a leader and you have a reasonably comfortable life and you're feeling like, well, when this is over, I'm going to be able to survive, or if my company goes down, I'll be able to work somewhere else, etc. But it's very hard to put yourself in the shoes of other people who are feeling extremely vulnerable right now. And so you tend to project your own sense of security onto other people, and you can't really understand why they're so fearful, why they're so panicky. I know for myself, I go back to the moments in my 20s when I was living paycheck to paycheck, and how debilitating it was, and how I was ridden with anxiety constantly. And so whenever I find myself feeling slightly unempathetic about people, I remember back then, and I remember how horrible that feeling was, and I can open myself to other people's experiences. The other thing a leader must have is you must understand that people are looking to leadership more than anything. It's like a parent figure. And what they want from a leader is somebody who has a vision of where the company is, of what the future will be like, of where we will be in 6 months or a year, and can communicate that in an eloquent fashion. So these are some of the timeless qualities that I think transcend whether we're in a crisis or not.
Yeah, I think you think you were spot on when you emphasized the vision. At least that's something that I personally can relate very much to when looking at leaders. I know, Mark, among many things that you have emphasized in your great line of work, one of the things that really have caught my eye when I've been reading your work is you differentiate between, rather than asking a question on what do you want in life, you should rather ask, what are you willing to struggle for? I think a lot of people are right now struggling, but do they know how much they're willing to struggle for something? Can you just give a deep dive into what you mean by asking this question rather than what you want in life?
Sure.
Yeah.
The starting point is it's easy to want the benefits of something. At the end of the day, we all want the same benefits. We all want to be rich. We all want to be popular. We all want to be liked and loved by everybody. Like, there's not really much that's interesting or unique about that. What is interesting and unique is what sacrifices each of us is willing to make to get those things, and what struggles each of us is willing to take on. And my argument has always been that who we tend to see ourselves as, or who we what our identity generally ends up becoming, and what we generally become known for, is the thing that we are willing to struggle for. And so I just try to reorient people's thinking away from thinking about benefits all the time, which I think has been kind of a cultural obsession for the last few decades, of just, think positive and, follow your dreams and all this stuff. And instead ask the more difficult question of what are you willing to give up? What are the sacrifices that perhaps your personality is more predisposed to than other people's? And I always use the simple example of writing. It's like, the reason Robert and I are writers is that there's something about the excruciating process of revising a paragraph like 11 times and still thinking it's terrible. There's something about that just, as painful as it can be, it lights me up. And for other people, it's torture, and they don't become writers, whereas something else, working with spreadsheets or learning how to code or whatever, to me, that sounds like hell. But, I have good friends who, like, they can get lost in a spreadsheet for days and forget to eat. So it's about, it's finding those moments of pain that were actually, like, feel meaningful and invigorating to us. And I think and this kind of relates to what Robert was saying about the stress test, is, what I've been saying about the COVID crisis is that crises tend to narrow our focus very, very quickly, because when everything becomes uncertain and there's a lot of stress in our lives, we quickly are reduced to the 2 to 3 things that are actually very, very important. When times are great, it's very easy to get distracted by, beach vacations in the Caribbean and, increasing my Instagram follower count and, hanging out at the happy hour on Thursday night. Like, it's very easy to get lost in those things. But suddenly, when your future is on the line, your health is on the line, you don't know, family and friends, their health is at jeopardy. Suddenly it becomes very, very clear what matters to you in your life and what you are actually willing to give things to make sacrifices for. And so in that sense, it's a very subtle benefit of periods like this, is that it narrows and crystallizes our focus on what actually matters in our lives. And it's the type of thing that we tend to not recognize that until it's over. It's the type of thing that we look back and we're like, wow, I'm actually kind of glad that happened, because my relationship with my family is much better now. And so I think there will come a day when we're on the other side of this, that people will start becoming aware of that crystallization.
Certainly. We have gotten tons of Q&A questions. One of them being related to what we discussed about before in terms of leadership advice. One person here is asking, in the author's opinions, what are the #1 personality traits / behaviors that are indicators of success? A big question, but I'm curious to hear your answers on this one.
Well, you know, I do a fair amount of consulting with people in business and all forms, actually, politics, business, entertainment. And they usually come to me with a particular problem, like they're having political issues with employees. They're dealing with someone who's very manipulative. They have a partner who's in the process of stealing their company away from them. They're dealing with a vicious rival, et cetera, et cetera. And they pay me a fair amount of money to give them advice. And I will think very deeply about their problem. And I will spend hours thinking about it. And then I'll come up with a plan and I'll give them a brilliant idea of how they can solve this. I think it's brilliant. And then lo and behold, days pass, weeks pass, and I try and check in. And they haven't followed one thing that I've said. They've just simply gone back to what they were doing. They'll try and frame it as if they did listen to me. But in truth, I can tell they're simply falling back on their old patterns of behavior. And so my lesson from that is I can tell the difference between somebody who will be a good leader and not by the degree that they are able to listen to advice, the degree that they're able to take criticism. Okay, they're a leader. They have a tremendous ego. They think they're God. Everyone says that you're wonderful. They love your ideas. That's what happens when you're a leader. People tend to become very sycophantic. And so you develop ability where you're not able to listen to anything. You want to hear that constant warm response from people. If I ever meet a leader, and it's generally 1 in 10 or 2 in 10, who can actually listen to my criticisms, and I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I come with a lot of experience doing that, and I think I have a pretty good perspective. If they actually listen to me and they do just a part of what I say, I go, that person has the right kind of DNA here. And what it is, it's the ability to adapt, and it's the ability to learn from failures, and it's a kind of inner flexibility where it's not all about your ego and getting people to recognize and say you're great. To me, that's the most important skill that I recognize in someone I think will be successful.
I'm going to be really obnoxious on this question and say that it depends what your definition of success is. And
we lost Mark.
Yeah.
Mark, you were vaporized for a moment.
Oh no! I said I'm going to be very obnoxious and be the guy who answers this by saying it depends. Oh, he can't hear me anymore. It depends how we define success. And it's.
Did you want me to go on or something? Or
no. Can he hear you? I think he lost both of us.
Yeah. I hear you both perfectly fine. Yeah, but go on, Mark. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
But to work off of the assumption that by success you mean, kind of conventional materialistic success. I agree with Robert, the ability to accept and adapt to failure. I would also throw in there and say it's probably in the top 3 or top 5, kind of a radical sense of accountability and responsibility, a sense of, everything that I say or do, or every result that happens in my life, I have some sort of responsibility for. And if I want to change that result, I have to do something. It's not this employee's fault or the market's fault or Wall Street's fault. It's, I have to do something. And I doubt you could either get to a leadership position or remain in a leadership position very long without that kind of radical sense of accountability. But it's definitely, I would think it's necessary to be able to do what Robert was describing, which is hear criticism, feedback, accept it, adapt to it, and move on.
Yeah, definitely. Another very relevant question that I think we should touch on is a question from Alexandra asking. It's a question to both of you. When you're having an off day emotionally, do you accept it? Do you be lazy, or do you just try to work through it? And do you guys have any tips if and when people have these days? Because I think eventually everyone has one of these days.
I'll go first if that's fine.
Yeah. Sure.
I generally speaking, obviously there's exceptions. Generally speaking, I don't try to fight an off day.
Okay.
Especially because, as Robert was talking about earlier, often you don't really know why you're having an off day. You might think you know. But you really have no idea, and there's not a whole lot of value in kind of wallowing in it or obsessing over it. The exception. So I'll just kind of, sometimes I'm like, you know what, this is just, I'm going to take off a little bit early today, rest, take a nap. That usually helps. And try to make tomorrow, good. There's obviously exceptions to that. If I'm on a strict deadline, if I have an important event to be at, or I have to, other people that I have commitments that I've made, then I try to power through it. But generally, if I'm just on my own, left to my own devices, I don't beat myself up for it, because that generally makes it worse.
Yeah. How about you, Robert?
I find, let's say just taking writing, for instance, and Mark will be able to relate to this. You have a day where it's just not flowing, where you think you're the stupidest person on the planet, where you're just, all your ideas have dried up and you think, God, what am I doing here? And to me, the best way to deal with that is through habits. I work every single day. I write every day, or I'm researching right now. And so I don't let a day pass where I'm not actually at the computer or my notepad writing for an hour or two. Yeah. And even when things aren't flowing, I still make myself write. And so you can develop this idea that if you kind of force yourself to do something, if you have the habit, if you just don't sit around and lay about, and you actually make yourself do something, do your work or whatever, you'll find that you can pass through these dry periods knowing that tomorrow will be better, So sometimes it's wise to just like step back and not do anything. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's better to actually push yourself through, to actually confront your writer's block or whatever, or your off day, and actually make yourself confront your work and try to push through it. Because oftentimes when you're feeling frustrated, or you're feeling bored, or feeling uninspired, I've noticed that those are the moments, it's like the darkness before the dawn. It's like things are bad just before something great is about to happen, right? Your frustration or your boredom or your off day is actually telling you that something isn't quite clicking in your brain. But if you just push yourself a little bit, if you go an extra step, if you keep working, if you keep doing it, something amazing will happen. So, sometimes you have to understand, if you're exhausted and you're overworked and something isn't clicking, all right, take a day off. And I do that sometimes. But other times you recognize it's not quite that. It's a signal that I just need to try harder and push through it.
And it's hard to navigate that. Like, it's hard to know if it's anxiety or exhaustion. It's hard to know if you are simply insecure about the work you're doing, or if you're actually not enjoying it. And it's, this comes back to that analysis of emotion that we've been talking about this whole talk. It's a constant, it's extremely difficult. And it's, I still go through periods where it takes me a couple days to figure out, like, oh no, I'm actually just avoiding this chapter because I think it's a garbage chapter. Like, it's, all these other reasons I came up with in my head of why I couldn't work today are not true. It's just, I don't like this chapter. And so it's, I think it's a personal struggle that we all have to go through. And I think while the principles will be true between all of us, it's one of those things that what works for one person isn't going to necessarily work for another. It's the type of thing that you have to learn your own kind of mental makeup and understand how your body and mind respond to certain triggers and emotions and activities and expectations, and then navigate those.
Yeah, certainly. Great advice. Well, guys, you know how the saying goes, time flies when you're having fun, and we have about 10 minutes left. And yeah, it's certainly already been a pleasure. And luckily, before we round off completely, I have a little surprise, which is our lightning round. And because we've had such a great turnout, we want to offer a very, very exclusive offer for all listeners. So hold tight, because not only do you have the opportunity to grab a discounted ticket as a listener here in the webinar, but you will also get a free copy of both Robert's book, The Laws of Human Nature, and Mark's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F. We will be handing them out at President Summit, and you will also get access to Robert's sit down with best-selling author, marketing mogul, and Robert's mentee, Ryan Holiday, who is also a great friend of Mark. Yeah. So we also include a 7-day cancellation policy just in case you need to bring a colleague. But without further ado, Robert and Mark, are you ready for a little lightning round?
Let's do it.
I guess.
Beautiful. Beautiful. What is the first question is, what is the best advice you've ever gotten?
I know this one. I'll go first.
Go ahead.
My father. So when I was first starting out in trying to create a business online, I was the victim of plagiarism a number of times. And it was really upsetting because the person who was plagiarizing me had a much larger audience than I did. And the ideas that I was coming up with were actually way more successful on this person's website. And I was really down, to the point where I thought about just giving up and quitting. And I remember I called my dad, and my dad's a very successful businessman, successful entrepreneur. And he's given me great advice around business my whole career. And I remember he explained to me, he said, these things happen in every business. And he said, look, there's two ways to make money in the world. The first is learning how to find golden eggs and keeping them for yourself. The second way is learning how to become a goose that lays the golden egg. And he said that most people spend all of their time trying to find golden eggs. But he said, if you learn how to be a goose that lays golden eggs, you will never, ever care if anybody takes a golden egg from you, because you can just produce another one. And it's stuck with me ever since. And actually, plagiarism doesn't really bother me anymore, because it still happens.
Yeah. Great. And Robert?
Well, I was about 24, 25 years old. I was living in New York. I was a journalist. I had just written an article for a magazine that I thought was really great.
Yeah.
And then the editors took me out to lunch that day after I turned in the article, and I was expecting him to lavish praise on me. And as he was downing his second or third vodka tonic at lunch, he said to me, Robert, your article is really, really bad. You're a very undisciplined writer. I don't think you have any future as a writer. I would suggest that you go to law school or business school or something else. And, to me, that is the best advice I've ever gotten, because I didn't listen to that asshole. I told myself, he is dealing with something personal. He has a great deal of envy. I know I'm a really good writer. Maybe writing articles about Italy isn't what I'm meant to do, etc. But, it really spurred me on. And I'm kind of a stubborn person. I don't really necessarily want to hear advice. I know that I'm going against what I said a great leader is. So I'm a bit of a hypocrite. But hearing other people criticize me and say that I'm worthless and I can't write, boy, did that motivate me. So people, I think using people's criticism and their doubts can be a very powerful motivating factor. It sure worked for me.
Great advice. Definitely. Great advice. The second question would be, Greatest purchase under $200.
Oh, man.
Possibly a book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here, I can recommend two right
Yeah.
here.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Mark, do you mind going
I don't
first?
know what that would be. Yeah, you go ahead,
I,
Robert. You
I
take
Okay.
that one.
I'm really struggling with this one because I don't buy much stuff. I'm really struggling with this one. I don't know, good pair of headphones, maybe. I like
Good pair of
music.
headphones. Yeah. Okay. So
So I'm
solid
very
advice.
excited.
Yeah. Not a lot of purchases under
Um,
$200. I get it. All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Robert? Anything there?
um, I I would just say I bought meditation pillows that you sit on. It's
Yeah.
kind of a classic, two sets of pillows, and you sit on them. And for 10 years, I've been sitting on those damn pillows every day. I've practically worn a hole through them, but it's probably the greatest purchase for me. I mean, this is kind of a silly question, but for me, just every day sitting on those damn pillows, I just love the feeling as my butt sinks into them, and I suddenly enter into this kind of beta state of meditating. So maybe those
Yeah.
$85 buckwheat filled pillows that you can buy on Amazon, my greatest purchase. I don't know.
It's headphones and pillows. That's all. That's perfect. The third the third question would be what person inspires you the most at the moment?
Man.
Yeah.
These are harder than the normal questions. uh, all right,
Well,
I got one. I got one. I
Go
got
ahead.
one. I got one. So
well, right
because
now,
this is
no,
oh
go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
oh sorry, mine will be fast. So
Yeah.
the documentary on the ESPN documentary, The Last Dance, is going on right now,
Yes.
and I'm a huge Michael Jordan fan, and I have been for years. And even though everything in the documentary is stuff I already knew about Michael
Yeah.
Jordan, just like watching it happen and watching him talk about it,
Yeah.
you know, he had so much confidence and resilience as a human being. Like, it was almost psychotic. And so it's just watching that documentary has just kind of revived my reverence for him. And
Yeah.
there's definitely been a few moments the last few weeks where, it's like I look at the clock and I'm like, oh yeah, I could turn in 20 minutes early. And then I'm like, man, what would Michael Jordan say right now? And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, I'll keep writing. Like,
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. Uh, definitely a must watch if people haven't watched that. For sure. What about you, Robert? The person who inspires you the most at the moment?
Well, I don't know if this is the right answer, but for the past 3.5 years, I don't want to get too political here, but we've been, at least personally for me, dealing with the current
Yeah.
president of the United States has almost feel like I've been taken hostage, that this isn't the country that I grew up in. And I've been dealing with great amounts of frustration and even anger at the current political situation in the United States. So I've been
Yeah.
desperately grasping on somebody who's going to come in and win the election in November and release all of this anger and frustration that I'm feeling. And I remember in 2008 when Obama won the election, my friends and I, we were like dancing. It was like the greatest moment. I'm just
Yeah.
looking ahead to November. So maybe he's literally one of the most uninspiring people you could think, but Joe Biden is sort of inspiring me now as that horse that I put all of my savings on, or all of my money in Vegas. Please, please, please win the election. I'm sorry to turn political, but that's the best way I can answer it.
That and the President Summit in November, two great things to look forward to. I completely understand.
Yeah.
Wonderful. The fourth question, we've already discussed a bit about meditation, but your best routine or hobby during the COVID-19?
Mark yet again.
um, so when this started, I was actually surprised. I've been working at home my whole career, and I was very
Yeah,
cavalier about how I would handle this, but I was surprised at actually how difficult it was without having like regular calls and
yeah,
meetings, places to go and trips to go on. I actually found it much harder to budget my time and get up on time and things like that. And so one thing I did is a friend of mine who also has a online business and is an author. He was having the
yeah,
same problem, and so we agreed that we would just get on Google Hangouts at 9 a.m. each morning, tell each other what we were going to do that day, and then just leave it on in the background so that both of us knew that the
yeah,
other one was sitting at his desk and doing something. And it's actually turned out, not only was it very effective, but it's actually turned out to be like such a good thing in general that I would gladly continue doing it after this is all over. Because
yeah,
I get to talk to a friend every morning. It gets me up at a certain time every morning.
yeah,
And it keeps me accountable. It's if I want to take an extra long lunch break, I'm like, well, Steve's gonna know I'm not in my chair, so I'm gonna feel
yeah.
like an asshole. So I should probably go back and get back to work. So it's been great all around. It's made me more productive. Get to hang out with a friend every day, and I've been a big fan of it.
Interesting, interesting. How about you, Robert?
Well, one thing that I've been doing is because, being a writer, as Mark will know, is a pretty lonely job. You're home a lot by yourself and you have to be alone. And before the crisis, you had some outlets, I would go out and see people every now and then, or I go traveling, etc. And so the loneliness factor has been very difficult. And what I've tried to do is to start writing longer emails or even what I would call quote unquote letters to people,
Yeah,
either Facebook messages or emails or Instagram messages or whatever, instead of the
yeah,
usual kind of one paragraph description or asking what people are up to or whatever. I would actually write several pages of what's been going on in my life and then eliciting from them. So I'm trying to go back to like what it was like before we had the internet and computers, where people actually sat down and wrote a 3 or 4 page letter in which they opened up about what they were feeling, about their experiences. And I found it's a really, really good way to connect to people. I'm actually really looking forward in the morning to receiving some of those responses from people. I've kept it to a relatively narrow circle so that I don't have this constant panicky feeling like I have to sit there and
yeah.
spend hours writing every day. But it's been very pleasant to get these long responses from people, to actually get to connect to them on a deep level. And maybe I will keep this habit afterwards, but I've found that it's at least helped solve a little bit of the loneliness factor.